Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Halfie Project podcast. My name is Becky, and sitting next to me is Cedric Sky City, and you are tuning in once again to the Halfie Project podcast. So, welcome, one and all in one. You're all welcome here. Today, we are enjoying a gloomy weather day in Seoul. It is rainy.
A little rainy, a little cloudy, a little gloomy.
That's pretty much what I said.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a pretty good day. The last 2 days have been very interesting because we have been talking to some really fascinating Korean Americans who are living here in Seoul for a different organization in their project. But it's been cool doing these interviews and just getting to learn their stories, right? Like what brought them to Korea, quote unquote, the motherland, how they view themselves in the States versus in Korea, and just the changes of their life. And it's been like, I don't know, it's been so fascinating, kind of in a way, to see my own life story sometimes reflected in the things that they say or the experiences that they have.
Yeah, we've interviewed a handful of guests over the last 2 months now. And again, these are all Korean Americans, whether they're they've been brought up in the culture overseas in America or they've been adopted. And I sort of anticipated that many of the stories would be very similar. There'd be more similarities and differences, but I've come to find that their story is very different. Even though there are pockets of similarities, everyone has a different view of themselves and of culture, specifically Korean culture. And I found it fascinating, especially with, one particular interview that I have in my mind, which I won't get into now. It's really cool because, I found myself relating to them in many ways, but also it's just like, wow, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, like, whoa, didn't see that coming. It's been like that.
Yeah.
Constant surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big honor to be able to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
Not only is it fulfilling, creatively speaking, but also in a personal way. Because on this podcast, we talk a lot about cultures, heritage, identity, that exploration, kind of a discovery also of self-awareness. And it's been most fascinating to do that, and then to also kind of have those conversations with other people who have gone on their own journeys. And that sort of, in a nice little roundabout way, leads to today's topic. And the question that we wanted to bring up and kind of discuss a little bit is why we think learning about our cultures is important. Now, there are some people for sure who have in a way, yes, it is also its own blessing to be born in one culture, raised in one culture, learn one culture, to have that given to them from their parents or their grandparents, the societies around them, and to never have to question or worry or feel like an outsider to the culture that they are born and grown up in. And that must be such a great feeling, right? And then you have other people who experience a different kind of blessing, which can also be, its own share of difficulties of feeling in between cultures or feeling like they're outside of a culture that they feel like they ought to understand or belong to or wish they had learned but didn't have the opportunity. And these are experiences that I find a lot of people with mixed ancestry or mixed cultures or a mixed home have these feelings or questions. And it can be a little bit, when it's not, I think, discussed about or brought up in these sort of concrete terms, it can just kind of feel a little bit vague, right? It's very easy to be like, oh, I just don't fit in. Or, I just don't understand it. People judge me. Something's wrong with me. It can easily fall into that. You default sort of into that, I guess, like blanket statements, instead of really deep diving or trying to understand or asking yourself, maybe there are aspects of my culture that I don't know about. I'm okay with not knowing it. Now let's explore. Let's learn, because the thing that I have found to be very true about culture is it is learned. And sometimes you learn it just implicitly from your upbringing, from your families. Sometimes you have to go out and study it and explore that and learn it. Culture, I believe, can be learned. And this is why we have culture classes, culture awareness courses, people who go to other countries, how to learn the language, how to understand societal rules, implicit and explicit, because culture is learned. And so we here at the Halfie Project, obviously, both of us have mixed culture homes. And we eventually, at some point in our own lives, had to ask, okay, do I really want to understand my heritage and all the things that go with it? And that includes culture. So why is it important to learn about our own cultures? That was my long intro.
And are you tossing the question to me?
I am. Here it goes.
Okay, I'll catch it. I mean, there are so many different reasons why. I will say on the forefront of my mind when it comes to that question is the fact that any sort of culture, understanding culture helps you to connect with the people of the culture. And when it's your own culture or cultures, it helps you to connect with the people that represent who you are. You know, in our instance, well, I guess I could say for me, it's like Black culture, even though there isn't a Black culture. I think we just sort of say that just to describe a certain shared like commonalities between, for example, African Americans and then, Korean culture. For me to I guess understand that helps me to connect with my parents, of course, but also like the people on both sides. So I think it's very important in that, because I think as human beings, everyone wants to feel belonging, right? It's just built in our DNA. And I think it's natural to want to be part of a group, right? That shares common traditions or beliefs. And so when you feel like you belong to your group, then you feel protected, you feel secure, you feel like you have a way to just understand one another as human beings. So I think that on a foundational level is one of the more important reasons why it's important to understand your cultures and to connect with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's when we talk about self-exploration, learning about my identity, who am I? Where do I fit in? Where do I belong? All of those things, I believe, are can be reflected in your community. And that community can sometimes look like the greater community, right? Your ethnic community, let's say, or it could mean the country that you're growing up in, that in its way is a community. Something in a smaller area like my town, we're all like this. Oh, you know right away what town I'm from, because it is the kind of community and these are the value or culture that can be found there. Can even shrink down to even smaller than that, my family, like the culture that lives inside your family. And a lot of times the way we explore ourselves or learn about ourselves or come to accept ourselves is in context of those communities. So it is extremely vital, I personally believe, to explore and understand culture. And it's funny because in some cases, it's like, we don't have a culture. This is just how things are done, because it is very implicit. It's almost like speaking one language since you are a child. And then when you grow older, people ask you, wait a minute, what? I don't understand. Why do you use that word to describe this? Why do you use that grammar structure? And it can be hard to explain it, right? Because it's so implicit, so part of your knowledge that you don't have the rules or how to explain it to someone from the outside looking in. And so culture can feel that way, honestly. If you ask somebody, like in my case, when I'm thinking about certain aspects of Korean culture, let's say, which felt to me, wait, I don't understand why you do that. Why do you do that? And you would ask someone who's born and raised in Korea, a lot of times it's like, that's just, I don't know, that's just how it is, right? That's Korean culture. Maybe there's no explanation. We don't know the explanation because it's just so implicit. It just feels so natural. So this is why when you're learning about cultures or trying to explore more about your identity, sometimes it can be really hard, especially when you don't have people who are encouraging you or people around you who are like, why do you even bother learning all of that, And so I feel like this is why I sometimes feel like in mixed homes, one culture is washed out by the other. or one can feel more innate and natural than a different culture.
Right.
Because that context of community doesn't exist. And so if you don't actively go out to learn or reach out or try to understand, and if you don't have the fortune to find somebody who's willing to teach you or show you, it can be pretty difficult, honestly.
Right. I mean, if you look at like the context of how we grew up, like we had a Korean parent in the house, but then we also living in America, we had an American parent who has their own subculture that they're used to and they grew up in. And I guess kind of to your point of one culture usually dominates another, I think like we would agree that in our house, we had a very big deal, like, or a big amount of Korean culture that was, exposed to us. But it's interesting because one, we're not living in the culture of Korea, so we're missing that element. Like, or I should say, we're not living in the country of Korea. We're missing that element. And then we're also living in just one person's memory or one person's expression of their own culture, being our moms, in one single household.
That's a very good
and
point.
so there's a lot that we tend to miss out on unless we have maybe Korean friends or a Korean community. But even then, it's a little different, So I find that interesting. It doesn't minimize, I guess, the value of the Korean culture that we've experienced, but it's just different than living here. Because like let's just say that our family is the same, our American dad and Korean mom lived here in Korea and we grew up in a Korean school system and we grew up speaking Korean, it would be totally different. We would be totally different.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And our perception of Korean culture would be different. So I just find that very interesting that it's like we lived in a house where we have Korean culture, but it's different. You know what I mean? It's just one expression of the culture lived out through our moms. Yeah, so I think that probably like the idea of that manifested itself in my life, and I would say probably in yours, I would imagine, when we first moved here, because we were like, oh wow, Korea is so different than what I actually thought. People are a little different than what I had in my mind or what I experienced back home. So I just find that very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And that's something that we have to navigate through as mixed Koreans. Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah.
I really like the point that you brought up about you are the culture that is living in the memory of one individual.
Yeah.
That's a really, I think, pointed statement because, culture, maybe not all aspects of culture, but I do believe that culture can change or evolve, adapt, right? The good example of this is when you see certain Korean communities in other countries. Again, context and community is really important, but you'll see, for example, like Korean communities living in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So in a way, it is actually impossible to look at those kind of communities and say, that's not Korean culture, because it is a form or an evolution or an adaptation of Korean culture in that context. And so the kind of culture that, say, we grew up with would be the culture that our mothers knew at that time from that context. And yet, when we return to Korea, we see how much things have changed, have evolved, it's not a different form, it's not like a Pokemon and you become a new form, but it's still the same. Yet there are things that are different now. And so we are constantly learning and changing and growing as well with the culture. So some things that, with my own study, I guess, of culture or exploration of Korean culture or cultures of my family, is the things that have really stood out to me is how my family connections have changed. Maybe you feel the same way. I'm not entirely sure. I have Korean family that lives here in Korea. And the way that I view them compared to how I understood and viewed my Korean family when I was younger has changed dramatically because of having lived here and learning the language and understanding the culture and experiencing life in Korea as opposed to life in the States. And the way that I view my family has changed quite a lot. Has it happened to you?
Well, I don't have Korean family here in Korea. So
What about like for your parents?
well, I think the more that I explored Korean culture actively or proactively, I should say, the more I can understand my mom and I can view her through a different lens than when I grew up. Because when I grew up, I knew that she was Korean. I knew that I was half Korean. I had that awareness, but she was number one, just my mom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I think in my 20s, late 20s up until now, I start to see her through a different lens because it's like, okay, now I understand why she does the things that she does. Now I understand why some of the things that used to annoy me about her, I'm like, oh, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say what those things are. But yeah, and so it helps me to have not only a greater appreciation, but more of a understanding and I guess just to use a term like a grace, like just sort of more patience in certain things.
Yes.
And it's almost like I get it and it's okay. That's why you said what you said, or that's why you have this certain way of talking to people or wanting to, impress people. It's like, oh, that's a Korean culture thing, because Korea, especially in her time, I mean, and even till today, there's like this, there's this concern about how people view you, status and position wise. And so my mom, she would do things that she would want to sort of, I guess, show people a certain side of her. And I'm like, I didn't get it. I remember my dad used to be like, why would you want to put out the best like silverware and stuff whenever your friends come over for Bible study and stuff like that? But now I'm like, oh, that's a Korean culture thing,
Why wouldn't you? What would you put out otherwise?
Well, I think from the perspective of my dad, it's just like,
Are they like your close friends?
well,
right?
yeah, that, and it's almost like, why are you trying to impress people? You know what I mean? And my dad, he wasn't like mean or like, rude about it. It was just like, he didn't get it. Whereas like, it's just one of those mentalities where he's like, let's just keep it real. You know what I mean? This is what we normally eat on, or, this is what our house normally looks like. You don't have to like put out the fine china as if this is what we eat off of every day. But my mom, and I tend to, now that I think about it, I tend to do the same thing.
That's the funny thing.
Yeah, I lean more that way.
I'm thinking, wait a minute, you are that way.
I am, yeah. I mean, but I understand it. And so it was just a difference of how, my dad viewed things and my mom.
Yeah.
But I understood why both viewed, the same thing their own way.
Yeah. And the thing about the term understanding can lead to grace. I think another word is compassion. The reason that I bring this up is because I'm in a lot of half Korean groups on Facebook or whatever websites, and I'm just a creeper. I just kind of hang back and watch what other people are saying. And this is not by any means saying whoever is in these groups is the average of what all half Koreans are thinking. And primarily in the United States, these groups are usually made up of. But something that I notice through reading, comments and posts and stuff is how oftentimes there's this underlining sense of resentment towards their Korean parent. Why do you do this? Why do you say these things to me? Why did you make my life so difficult? What was the purpose for this sort of behavior, these actions towards me? Why did you make me feel a certain way? Why? And a lot of times there's no answers, and people mask it with jokes and memes and be like, "Oh, haha, that's what Korean moms do."
Right.
But while it is saying I recognize that there's differences, I feel oftentimes it is a lack of understanding behind certain words or actions. Now, of course, there's no way I can say like, "This is why your mom did this to you when you were young because she's Korean. This is the explanation." There's no way because everyone's very different.
Right.
But I oftentimes feel like there's a disconnect in understanding the culture from which that parent is coming from, and out of that culture that they make their choices or the way that they think. And so this is exactly what I was saying about this earlier. Sometimes we are not fortunate to be when we're in a mixed home to understand or learn both cultures.
Right.
Sometimes there's a point where it's like We weren't taught that. We weren't passed that down. Yet we are still living in the same home with an individual who is acting and speaking out of a certain culture. And so we don't understand what's going on. And that can cause misunderstanding, can cause a lot of pain, can cause a lot of trauma. And at least for me personally, having this time to explore and to think and really study about Korean culture has, one, led to more understanding, not only of myself, but of my family, which too has led to this grace and compassion. I see now why you did the things that you did. And it makes it easier for me to forgive.
Right. I have a perfect example. And I think a lot of us halfies, specifically like half Koreans, we could relate to this. And I say this in that I actually can't relate to it because it didn't happen to me because my mom's different. But
because your mom's an angel. She's so sweet.
She's very sweet.
Yeah.
99% of the time. Yeah, if you make her mad though. Yeah, it's the, like, for example, I just, growing up and even now I see or hear stories of people saying, yeah, my mom or dad is just like, they yell at me and they're always screaming at me and they're like, yeah, 밥 먹어, and it's like, come eat, very rudely. But they never hear the words, I love you from their Korean parent. Well, if you understood through the culture, and not to say that everyone's like this or this is like something that's ingrained in everybody in the culture, but in a way that is their parents saying, I love you. Because a lot of parents aren't necessarily affectionate, especially like a lot of Korean dads, from what I hear. They're not like verbally affectionate. There are Korean dads that are that way. But, they'll say things like, make sure you eat, come back safely, 잘 갔다 와, like come back safely from wherever you're going. That's them saying, I love you in a different way. But if you interpret that as, oh my gosh, it's just so rude. They just have to say that because they're my parent.
Or you're meddling so much in my life. Doesn't matter where I'm going.
Right. Then you see them through a certain lens, which is not really accurate because you don't understand that part of the culture maybe. And whereas if you view it as, it is annoying, but it's because they love me, then you have more compassion and you have more understanding and, potentially respect for your parent. So that's why it's so important to understand.
Yeah.
And like you said, we don't always have that privilege of really understanding it. And I'm not bashing anyone who interprets it in a different way. It's just one of those things that I've sort of learned after hearing stories of people.
Yeah.
Now my mom she's very like, I love you. She's very vocal about that. And she's super sweet. So I didn't experience that, but through my friends and just through stories I even read and hear about online, that seems to be the case. And not only Korean parents, but a lot of Asian parents are the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a little bit like almost nervous to bring this point up because obviously I'm not a spokesperson for all half Koreans. But something that I recognize, and I recognize in myself in the past as well, is almost a sense of like, there can be many reasons for it, but arrogance. As in like, well, I know why she did that. This is what Korean people do. Like, almost like, kind of like making, like saying, I know, and acting out of that concept of I know, when in reality, I actually don't know. I didn't study. I didn't speak Korean. I didn't have the privilege of understanding the culture. And yet I would make judgments because I am half Korean and make statements as if I knew.
Right.
And I see today, and this is of no fault, especially to older generations of half Koreans who had no privilege of having the Korean community around them or, learning from their parents or the language. But it is certainly different coming from a standpoint of, I understand the Korean culture and yeah, I know. Versus someone who says, well, I'm half Korean. I have a right to say this because this is my culture. I know. Culture is not something I think you are innately born with. I think you maybe have access to it. You may have extra steps forward, but it is a learned thing. And I think we should be, especially people of mixed heritage, too. It's kind of like a game, like a dancing on one end or the other, right? You got to be pretty cautious about it to feel accepted, but also to recognize yeah, I have things to learn and to be okay with that. But it can feel a little bit like, but I have a right. I should know this.
Right. And I tend to feel that way sometimes, which is why I'm hard on myself when I feel like there's something I should know, but I don't. It's one of those things where I'm not arrogant about it. I'm more insecure about it. I'm like, I should know this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that is equally as unhealthy.
I totally agree. We had a message from one of our listeners, and she was saying how kind of upsetting it is to see many people that she sees who are half Korean, who have never spoken the Korean language, who have never visited Korea, who maybe are disconnected from Korean culture whatsoever. But in the in the wake of the racist attacks happening against Asian Americans in the U.S., coming out very strongly and vocally, like, I'm half Korean and I'm so against this, and this is why, because that's my people. And she was kind of thinking like, whoa, where did it come from? Never in your life have I ever seen you being proud of your heritage or speaking Korean or eating Korean food, and then coming up and claiming this culture that you don't know anything about. And for her, it's a weird thing, right? Because while simultaneously we're saying we're half Korean, I claim this is my heritage and my culture, I have a right to call myself Korean. While at the same time, in a way, it is also can be a facade. Like, oh, I'm half Korean, I'm Korean, I have a right to say this, when you actually don't know anything about the culture itself. And I think this is why there can be a feeling of like unsettlement in ourselves, or judging ourselves, or being hard on ourselves, kind of like what you were saying. But this is why I feel a little cautious bringing this up. I can only speak out of my own experience of having felt that. But I think this is, again, why this journey of identity and culture are very closely tied together. At least it was for me.
Right.
So family connection, that was a really important one. And going hand in hand with that is, I wrote in Korean, like, misunderstanding, pulgi. How would you translate that? Like unraveling misunderstandings, right? Maybe it is family trauma. I think in my case, it was a little bit of that. And through understanding, you're able to unravel maybe those misunderstandings or hurts that you carry for a very, very, very long time. And through having understanding or exploration of culture, it helps you to have that compassion. And I think that it does create in yourself the ability to say, okay, I get it, and I can let that go. So I think in a lot of mixed homes, this trauma can exist. And a way to let go of those sufferings that maybe you experienced when you were younger is to study and understand these cultures which your parents are coming from, to understand why they did what they did.
Yeah, it's sort of like a self-therapy. Like if you want to go down the journey of really understanding one or both sides of whoever, your cultures are, it could lead to a lot of healing, I would imagine, right? I think for me, more than healing, it just led to just understanding and more respect for my mom, more respect for people in Korea, and just even nowadays, like there are a lot of things where I'm like, why do people do that? Why do people say this, or why are people scared of people that are older than them or in a higher position? But because like if you view that from like at least an American lens that I'm used to, it's sort of like you sort of kind of lose a little bit of respect for someone like that. It's like, grow a backbone, But when you understand the culture, you're like, oh, I totally get it.
And you have manners and I don't.
Right.
Yeah, there's always a different perspective, a different way. And this is why can be difficult when it comes to talking about culture like this, because it is, in a way, having to let go of these perceptions that you implicitly understand, that you've grown up with thinking, this is just how it is. You have to put that down and really be like, okay, I'm going to now put myself in your shoes, try to understand where you're coming from. And that's no easy task. But it's what also makes it very fascinating, and what leads to my next point, having a deeper appreciation of not only yourself, but your heritage and your family and the history that you come from. I think it is one thing to, read history books, let's say about your grandfather. Oh, wow, he did this. Cool. Versus living in the culture and the country and the language and the things that he experienced. And then you read it again and you come to, well, this must have been his thought process. Wow, that must have been a really hard choice for him to make. Oh my goodness, the sacrifices. And then it gives you a deeper appreciation for the heritage and where you have come from.
Right. Like the moment I understood really what the Korean War meant, because I grew up knowing that there was a Korean War, my mom was born in the middle of it, blah, blah, blah. But then when you understand like what happened and what the people actually went through, and you're reading stories of people and reading about how families were, separated between the North and the South, then it gives you a different appreciation for your culture. Like I'm so proud to be Korean because of just the history and the fact that Korea has always just been resilient and stuck together. And that makes me even more proud. Whereas as a kid growing up, I didn't understand it and I didn't even care,
Yeah.
And so I think that was, even doing these podcasts and researching, it's just sort of like putting more, I don't know, appreciation in the jar that's just constantly growing.
Yeah,
more
the
appreciation
jar.
Right.
So we'll have a huge one. Yeah.
Exactly.
Full of appreciations. I do want to continue this conversation, but we're going to keep this one short and sweet. If you guys want to ask more questions, or you have your own comments or input, or about your own journeys or culture or your own struggles, we get it. We've been there and we're still there. It's a lifelong journey, I think. And so it's very cool that we have this community to talk about these things together. And especially having a co-host who gets it. That is, for me, a very significant thing. So we'd love to hear from you, and you can always get in touch at thehalfieproject@gmail.com. So we're going to just wrap it up here, but we'll, I'm sure, continue this conversation in a future episode. By the way, thanks so much for the listener mail that you guys have been sending us. I'm going to read a couple emails in the next episode, so be sure to stay tuned for that. All right, thank you guys for listening. We are the Halfie Project.